Well, it's a new year, and that means we are back with a fresh look at what is happening in the economy, both here in Alberta and Canada, but also around the world. And coming into 2023, things are a bit in flux. The cost of living is still weighing very heavily on people's minds, and we might be in for a global recession. But Alberta's job market is white hot. People are moving to the province, and wage growth is expected to accelerate this year. Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. And today we are joined by BCA's economics team, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic, to discuss the latest economic update from the Business Council. What is going on in the labor force, consumer sentiment, potential for a global recession, and just expectations for the coming year. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
Well, we're just 3 weeks into 2023, but already we're back with our first quarterly economic update on Alberta with BCA's incredible economics team, Alicia and Mike. Right now, there's much in flux in the province. People are concerned about rising inflation, rising cost of living, the cost of healthcare, and even a looming global recession. But before we get to all that, I'd like it if I could ask you, can you both just give me kind of the overview? What's happening in the Alberta economy at the moment? What's the big picture?
Yeah, I would say overall, 2023 is kind of carrying it over the same stories that we've seen the past year. So it's the same but different. And I think what's different for Alberta's case is I think we have reason to believe that Alberta will actually fare better coming into this year than what we've seen in the past. So in the same way that Alberta fared worse during 2020 and that really hard hit of the oil price collapse as well, we can, I think, see some optimism for Alberta looking into 2023.
So what's the reason for that? Pulling that a little bit further, there's signs that we might be seeing a national or even a global recession. But what do you think is going to happen in Alberta? Are we going to experience the same as the rest of the country or something different?
Yeah, I think a couple of things going on here. So one thing is high commodity prices. So even though we're expecting them to moderate looking into this year, which is very good for consumers and for the inflation story, they're still going to be higher than what we've seen historically, right? And so that's certainly good for Alberta's resource-based economy. We're seeing a lot of good things, not only with oil and gas, but also with agriculture, increasingly with manufacturing as well. So I think that's a really good news story. The other part, though, is I think in some ways we're just a little bit late to the party, but we're just getting there as far as our labor market. So we're seeing the signs with both our labor market, with housing, with in-migration, that I think other provinces saw earlier on that Alberta's just really seeing now.
Right.
And I think one other related thing that's going to help out with that is the amount of investment that's been coming into the province. So we've seen, a number of very high-profile announcements over the last 6-8 months, construction getting underway in some major projects. And so that kind of activity, which we haven't seen a lot of in Alberta in the last 5 or 6 years, I think that's also going to factor in.
So let's zero in on the labor market. And one of the headlines from this report: hot labor market, but very cool wages.
Hot labor market.
Let's talk. So we have very high job vacancy rate, but also low unemployment, and so that's leading to a very hot labor market. I want to ask what's driving that, but before we get there, can you explain, when we say tight labor market or a hot labor market, what are we referring to?
Well, what we're talking about there is, the number of jobs that are available, the number of businesses that are looking to add workers, and whether they can fill them. And so, typically if you have a very high unemployment rate, that's evidence of the opposite of that, where you've got a lot of people who are looking for work and not a lot of positions potentially available for them. And right now we have the exact opposite of that, where we've got about 100,000 job vacancies in the province. Those are businesses that are looking to fill positions, and they can't find the people to do them. So the unemployment rate is falling. The number of jobs is increasing because employers are hiring whoever they can. But it's, it really shifts the balance of power, or at least it should, onto the workers themselves, because they are the ones that are in demand right now. And so that's what we mean.
So what is leading Alberta's hot job market right now in terms of industries and other factors that are kind of feeding into this?
Yeah, I would say one factor is actually this longer term trend, this shift in terms of employment away from goods producing industries and into services. So professional services is really a standout star when you look over the last couple of years. We've seen, I think it's something like 115,000 jobs added in the Alberta labor force. Almost 50,000 of these are in professional services. So things like engineering and advertising firms, things that are not associated with the production of a particular good.
Right.
So that's one really big shift and increase that we've seen. Another, though, more recently has actually been in construction, which I think speaks to, at least in part, this residential piece of new people moving to Alberta, new people in particular choosing Calgary as home, which is this whole other big story for Alberta.
And so then the other thing that has been happening in Alberta is just really weak wage growth. And just Alberta's wages not necessarily advantageous anymore. And we're actually falling behind the national average. So what is happening there, and what impact might a tight labor market actually have on wage pressure and wage growth?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're seeing is just us being late to the party. When we look back at the first half of 2022, we still had about a 1 percentage point unemployment gap with other provinces.
Like ours was higher.
Ours was much higher,
Right.
And the back half, though, that narrowed quite a bit to about half of that. So that's why I think that we're about to see the wage growth that other provinces have already seen. And in fact, those two industries that I just spoke to, professional services and construction, are the only two industries where wages have actually kept pace with the national average, where they've
Right.
actually grown. So I think we're already seeing the higher demand there play out into wages. And I think it's only a matter of time, especially when you have participation as high as you do, unemployment as low as you do, job vacancy numbers so high, and our employers are still telling us that they want to increase staffing.
Right.
So it's sort of a bit of a perfect storm maybe for wages to increase. It's probably also worth mentioning in that discussion, though, that I think in most categories, Alberta would still have a wage advantage over most other provinces, even though we've been growing at a much slower rate than they have been.
I was just going to say that is entirely the case. So we have this wage premium that people can normally enjoy living and working in Alberta, and that has been that's been eroding for the last several years, and it's still higher wages on average in Alberta than they are in other provinces, but the gap between us and elsewhere in the country is a lot lower than it used to be.
So the other thing on labor force, so it's tight. We have lots of jobs and like fewer Albertans. We also have lots of people coming to the province. I think it was 33,000 move and 14 left. So we've got a huge inflow of people coming to the province. What impact do you think that will have on maybe alleviating some of these labor shortages? And, what is driving some of that? Do you think the Alberta's Calling campaign is starting to have a bit of an impact on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So we had, the most recent data that we had showed 19,000 people on a net basis moved to Alberta over the summer. And, that's the highest going back at least 15, 20 years for a single quarter. And
That's incredible.
It's an incredible surge. And what's interesting about it, I find, is that it's not being driven by anything as obvious as some of our past surges. So, if you look back at other times when we've seen large influxes of people moving to Alberta, it's usually been during some sort of oil boom. And it's not just a high price boom, it's an investment boom. And so we have tons of economic activity, new construction, new expansion going on. And that's typically been what's driven that sort of migration in the past. And, the Alberta economy has been doing well and is doing well, but it's not that same kind of a driver this time around. And so that 19,000 is a huge spike. I'm not sure if we could reasonably expect that to continue into the future. I mean, we all hope and want it to remain positive, but it's a large spike, and I think a lot of it has more to do with affordability issues across Canada. So that this Alberta's Calling campaign, which you mentioned before, that's something that targets Vancouver, Toronto, places that have high housing costs, and it's lower here for now. And so this is it is lower here. It's not a for now statement, but
well, we'll see.
Yeah, and so there's a bit more of an affordability component to that too, and this sense that the Alberta economy is doing well. So that's. It's a combination of economic growth and opportunity and affordability, but I think that the affordability component is a bit more than before. And what's really interesting to me, though, is that this Alberta is Calling campaign is one that it's attracted a lot of attention everywhere, but the data that we're looking at right now, it's still too early to pin that increase on the campaign.
Yeah,
And
totally.
The campaign was an August thing, and this data is, the July through September periods. And so, there's no way people heard in Alberta is calling campaign in August and packed up and moved 2 weeks later. So
Right. Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah, I get from like a pure economist standpoint, I'm beginning to think we're getting to the point that we can assign some, at least, correlation to the Alberta's calling campaign. I mean, any marketing, and I've spent my whole career in marketing, it's really hard to ever say this ad led to this thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's undeniable it's caused some national conversation.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
100%.
And two, I think it also speaks to the validity of the campaign, right? And that the things that they are talking about are the things that are already bringing people here.
Right.
yeah,
Totally.
it clearly resonates. I mean, that's why it's getting so much attention.
One of my favorite marketing quotes ever, I think it's from Seth Godin, says, the word marketing should mean, what do we call it when we make something people want? And I think this is an example of that, actually, which is, and you sort of just said it, Alicia, that like the premise of the campaign is well-paying jobs, an affordable lifestyle in a beautiful setting, which both happens to be true and a thing that people want. So, it sort of makes sense to me that it would be having an impact. And at some time later, we'll have a deeper dive on housing, because I think it's really interesting. We have housing challenges in Alberta, affordability challenges, but also what you were just saying, Mike, is undeniably true that like it is much more affordable compared to at least many of the other big cities. A couple people on median incomes can actually afford their own home in most of the major cities in Alberta, and that's just not the case in Vancouver or Toronto.
Yeah, what's interesting is how that's going to play out down the road, because with Canada's new higher immigration targets and with this huge influx of people moving into Alberta from other provinces, that does put some pressure on the housing stock in Alberta. And so we do have high housing starts. That's great. Whether they're high enough to keep pace is another question, because we've shown before that in other work that we've done that the total housing stock in Canada is actually really small compared to other OECD countries. That's one of the reasons why prices are so high here. And so if people start flooding to the Alberta market, where we do have relatively affordable houses, it's certainly going to prevent price decreases like we've seen in other markets, or it'll buffer that trend.
To take a peek at just one industry there, do you think that all this in-migration bodes really well for the home building sector in Alberta, for the construction sector? I know that you talked to some of those CEOs and folks within the Business Council membership. Are they excited?
Oh yeah, they 100% are.
Very, very excited.
How could they not be?
In fact, I'm hearing that Calgary in particular is the market to look to in 2023 as the example for a great, strong year, I guess.
Yeah.
Great.
The only challenge there is going to be, and I've talked to people, not just the CEOs of these companies, but people who are actually involved in the construction sector working on these things, and
Swinging hammers.
finding the people. Yeah, like seriously, finding people to swing the hammers, basic carpentry skill, and everything else that's associated with building a house, but especially like internal carpentry. Like those are areas that it's going to be tough to find people, and there's a lot of demand out there.
So let's keep talking about the Alberta economy a little bit more generally. Recent surveys show that 5 out of 6 Canadians think we're already in a recession. And, I've seen the numbers that you've shared with me that that's not exactly the case yet. So what is the case? And if we're not in a recession, why do 5 out of 6 Canadians feel like we are?
Well, I mean, 2 reasons that leap to my mind that for why they think they are. The first one is that interest rates have been increasing steadily for the last, since the beginning of 2022. We've seen many rate hikes, and 1 or 2 more expected. And part of that, people keep getting told that we're about to be in a recession. And rising interest rates are intended to slow the economy and curb inflation, and so they get, it's part of the sort of media and economic narrative that the cause-effect relationship eventually is going to be higher interest rates will lead to economic slowdown, which could lead to a recession. So that's one reason. And the second one is that the technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, but nobody cares about what that means. What they actually care about is what they can afford and what they can do. And so, what we've been talking about here is we've had high inflation in Alberta, across Canada and elsewhere, and low wage growth. And so what that means is that people are worse off. Their money isn't going as far. And they see themselves without the same ability to afford to buy basic goods and services as they did in the past, and that on a personal level is basically what a recession looks like. I am poorer now than I was before, and so I think that's what's driving that feeling.
When media narrative or what you're hearing kind of in the zeitgeist says a recession's coming and interest rates keep going up and my paycheck just isn't going as far at the grocery store, that's what a recession feels like.
Exactly.
And right now, one of the interesting things with the retail data is basically people are still trying to achieve that same standard of living, but they're simply having to pay more. And so the reality is, after you've spent down your savings, as interest rates keep going higher and financing gets more expensive, at a certain point, you just can't maintain that same standard of living. And I think that's especially the case in Alberta.
So putting together a couple pieces here, Canada is teetering on the edge of a recession, but not quite there yet. Well, Alberta is looking pretty optimistic. We're kind of the port in the storm or the bright light. Do you think it's fair to say that at the moment, Alberta is one of the main drivers of the remaining growth that Canada sees?
It's certainly the bright spot in the Canadian economy. I mean, most bank forecasts and others suggest that Alberta will be the leading growth performer in 2023 or among like the top two. And, the reasons for that are pretty obvious. We've got high natural resource prices that are helping the economy. The resource sector, agriculture is doing well. Business optimism remains high. We've got a lot of people moving to the province we just talked about. All these things are going to drive headline economic growth in the province. And so, to the extent that, inflation is being caused by high food prices and to the extent that it's being caused by high energy prices, those are things that we produce. So we're not just getting hit on the consumer side, we're benefiting on the production side. Whether or not it's driving growth in the country might be a little strong. It's, Alberta is about, 10% of the population and 12-13% of the national economy. And so that 12-13% is doing better than the rest, for sure. Whether it's enough to keep the entire country afloat might be overstating it a little bit.
Let's talk about business expectations. Oftentimes it's business investment that more or less drives economic activity, probably one of the most important things in an economy. The Business Council, our latest surveys show that business investment looks to be relatively strong in Alberta, but you've said that might be difficult to maintain. Why is that?
Yeah, so the short answer is basically it's becoming more expensive to make those major investments, right? Interest rates are going up. That starts to make those big investments that businesses otherwise would like to make more expensive and a little bit less likely. That said, what was interesting to me is we have this business expectations survey that we do 3 times a year with our members. And as of the latest one, we had already seen 5 or so rate hikes. And even then, there were more businesses telling us we're going to increase our investment activity into 2023 than the numbers saying that they were going to cut back. And that to me was pretty
it's like
rosy,
the balance, yeah.
Right? Given that we had already seen such a big shift in interest rates. The question, though, is will that continue moving forward, right? We've already seen a couple more rate hikes since then, may see one more yet, and that's the big question of this year. But to have a 20% balance of expectations, so to speak, is pretty good, all things considered.
You're right. I think it'd be crazy for us to see another rate hike, but I think we might just see crazy.
I suspect we will, yeah.
Great. Let's pivot to, the topic that I hear in every Tim Hortons and Starbucks line that I'm in for the last several months, which is inflation. And, starting first at the global perspective, according to this recent survey that you featured in the snapshot, 68% of people globally describe the current economic state of their country as bad. So we're at a pretty pessimistic place globally, with 2/3 of people sort of feeling that way. And in Canada, we're just below that average at 66% of people thinking the economic state of Canada is bad. Can you speak to these stats and what you think is driving them?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we talked about previously, in that inflation is a real hardship. And even though, you might still have your job, which is great, the fact is our standard of living has declined, especially in Alberta. We simply can't afford as much as we could a year ago. And it's one of those things that's just so in your face as a consumer every time you go to the grocery store. I mean, my husband and I are just mind blown, right? That you keep looking at the same prices of the same products over the course of the year, and you're like, oh my goodness, right? And it's just so in your face that it's not just economists looking at data, it's real people looking at real prices of things that they need.
Yeah, like butter, for example. I mean, I bake a ton, and so butter is obviously an essential ingredient. I do not want to spend $7-8 on butter. So I'm like, is it cheaper for me to make my own butter? Because I could totally just buy heavy cream, but then even that's going up. And I'm like,
I think your heavy cream.
I'm like, oh my goodness, maybe I need a new hobby that's not as expensive.
Yeah, it just might be cheaper. This would be another public policy topic for us to discuss at some point in the future, is food prices. What goes into them and what might make them cheaper, or how you might affect them, because it's a hard thing to do. And I'm just obsessed with this question lately, in part because I've been asked by policy people on the left of center, policy people on the right of center, everyday people, bureaucrats, just all the sort of same question: how could we make food cheaper? And the answers are frankly not simple. There's a few ideas. I think competition could play a big role, but it's not easy to do.
No, there are a lot of a lot of contributing factors to that, whether it's, the price of the base food ingredients themselves, transportation costs with, higher fuel prices, even though those are coming down recently. There's supply management for all the things that Britt just talked about is a major issue. I mean, that's driving up the cost.
Anti-competitive.
Of dairy prices. Yeah. And so there are a lot of factors.
And I would just add at the provincial level, thinking about our government and what we can do, I would say a bigger factor to focus on instead is really rising wages and wage growth. What can we do to affect that rather than focusing on food prices in particular, something that is a little bit hard, at least for us as a singular province to do very much
mostly
about.
driven by global flows. And food is probably one of the most substitutable goods that ever exists. So hard for any one individual province. Well, I'll ask you to do your one other favorite thing, which is predict the future. What do you think we're going to see happen with inflation over the next several quarters in Canada?
I think we have reason to believe that it will moderate. And then the biggest reason for that is because global factors, especially in Alberta, are over 70% of what's driving those big headline numbers, right? And those are the same factors that are expected to moderate. It doesn't require the Bank of Canada. It doesn't require consumers doing anything differently. We already know that that's coming. So I think that's really...
So 70% of what's driving inflation in our province
really
has almost nothing to do with the province and actually very little even to do with the country. You're saying these are global factors.
For sure. And I think the other thing that we have working in our favor as far as, the challenge with inflation is there can be these longer term consequences of, not being able to afford food. You can imagine the consequences on somebody's life down the road that brings. The good news for us in Alberta is we do have certain supports in place that frankly other jurisdictions just wouldn't be able to afford. Now the hope is that wouldn't further stoke inflation, which goes back to the assumption of hopefully, most of the forces at play here are global, but it is encouraging to at least have some supports, especially for those, those folks who are lowest income into middle income that are expected to be hurt the most longer term.
And I think that one thing to add to that too is that one of the reasons why I think it's fair to assume that inflation is going to moderate is that one of the main drivers is commodity prices. And so we've seen, even though energy prices and agricultural product prices in particular, they're still a lot higher than they've been in recent years, but they've also come down a lot. We're over the spike in those things. We're seeing
oil prices in the 70s or very low 80s versus well north of 100.
100,
110.
A little different, yeah.
So that's going to be a helpful factor. And in fact, most of the inflation data that we look at seasonally unadjusted year-over-year growth. Typically, that's how the headline number is, like your 6, 7, 8% or whatever we happen to be in a given month, or coming down from that. But on a month-to-month basis, the prices are actually falling. We have seen some very small decreases or flat prices from, like, say, November to December, and so that's helpful as well. So we are seeing a bit of relief.
Right, and gas prices at the pump would be an example.
From 1 week to the next, 1 month to the next, they're not getting worse 1 month to the next. They're definitely a lot higher than they were a year ago, no question about that. But they're not deteriorating now. So there's at least that sort of silver lining to it.
What do you think Albertans and Canadians can expect over the next few months, just broadly?
Well, I think one of the things we're looking to see is how many more interest rate hikes there are going to be. Like we just talked about this, a lot of what's driving inflation is outside of Canada's control, but that doesn't mean that the Bank of Canada is sitting idly by. Obviously, they've been raising interest rates, and so we're seeing year-over-year inflation slow. We're seeing month-to-month price growth be flat or slightly negative. And one of the questions is, will they continue to increase interest rates? And the really big one for me is the impact of those kinds of moves. When you raise interest rates, it doesn't have an overnight effect on people. It usually takes at least 6 months for that to kick in. And we've seen a lot of rate hikes that are still outside of that 6-month window. So we don't know what the impact, or we haven't seen the full impact of those rate hikes yet. And so, we talk about whether we're going to we're going to actually fall into recession in 2023. Everybody expects slower growth, but it's a question of how much slower. And part of it is looking to see what the actual impact of those rate hikes has or will be once they fully play out.
I'll tell you one impact I'm kind of interested in. It's partly, something I think is extra visible in January of each year, is what I might call like pre-inflation. People just assuming that there's going to be relatively high levels of inflation, or kind of baking in potential rate hikes and increasing prices of goods or services sort of proactively, which I think is actually pretty dangerous, and I'm beginning to see a little bit of that. It'll be interesting to sort of keep our eye on it if we're seeing more of that. People saying, well, I'm going to increase prices in advance of the inflation because I just think it's coming down the pipe.
For sure. And I was looking at the latest Bank of Canada survey of businesses, and what they found was that most businesses don't expect inflation to go back down to normal levels until 2026. So if I'm a business and I need to think about my shareholders and profits and my employment, right, I'm going to have to think about the fact that prices and my inputs are probably going to remain high and continue to increase. The hope is that the Bank of Canada can counteract that and assure people that that will not be the case, but it will be a challenge. And to Mike's point, we won't know that we screwed up and did too much until it's way too late. And so here we are.
So I think there's reasonable evidence to sort of sit back a little bit and see what the impact of all the rate hikes so far has been. But we'll see if that's what they choose to do.
So as we wrap up, one final thought. What is one insider takeaway that someone should take away from this report?
Well, I think the main one for me is sort of the general theme that we touched on earlier, and that is that in the face of a widely expected global economic slowdown, in the face of a widely expected Canadian economic slowdown, that Alberta is in a position to do well, relatively speaking. So we're not we don't have the wind at our backs here, but we're still in a good position, and of all the places to be in the face of this kind of global economic slowdown and national slowdown, that Alberta is poised to come out and do better than most, if not all.
Totally. And we'll be back in April for our next update.
To see if we were right or not.
We'll have a scorecard.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.